As I got ready to leave Romanticism behind, it occurred to me that I did not explicitly use the term that our historians apply to the Houses of Parliament, built in the mid-19th century on a sort of 12th century model. The term is Gothic Revival, and as I did explain, it reflected a nostalgia for the beauty, craftsmanship, and spiritual certainties of an earlier age. Here's another famous Gothic Revival work from a century earlier. Okay, on to the second half of the 19th century. At this point in our story, the pace of change quickens rather dramatically. The Industrial Revolution enters its second phase with the rise of the steel, electricity, chemical, and automobile industry. More rural workers flock to the cities. Science reigns supreme, and philosophers and social scientists attempt to make every discipline scientific. Darwin challenges religious concepts of creation and human life. Marx challenges the social order, and a rising generation of artists challenges the conventions of Academy-approved painting. Okay, don't worry about knowing all of these early modernist style. We'll only talk about the first of these movements in this unit. But I thought it might be a good time to explain that the term modernism is, confusingly, used to describe the intellectual and artistic movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Much of what we call modern art historians call postmodern art, or they pin it with a confusing array of labels, many of which, alas, we will need to learn in the coming units. Have you been waiting for the next generation to turn on their artistic moms and dads? Those romantics. They were so sentimental, so given to unnecessary drama. Yes, many were engaged in current social issues. Think of the raft of the Medusa or slave ship. But did they take to the barricades themselves? Or did they, like Delacroix, hide inside and peek out the windows at the unruly masses? To the realists who succeeded them, the romantics' art was just too pretty. Time for some gritty reality. Alas, this painting, a required work, no longer exists. It was destroyed during World War II, along with 154 other paintings when a transport vehicle moving the pictures to a castle for safekeeping was bombed by Allied forces, that is, by our team. But we have photographs of the work, which seems especially appropriate since we're now on the eve of photography. This was actually quite a huge painting. 9 feet wide, 12 feet tall. That alone would have startled viewers accustomed to French Academy paintings. Huge canvases were usually reserved for the big history paintings that members of the French Academy considered the highest form of art. So, here's an example of a French Academy history painting from the same period. It's even more immense than Stonebreaker's, 25 feet wide, but of course it's crowded with figures. Courbet hated this kind of painting, and in this famous quote, he explains why. So in your own words, what's he saying? Paint what you see, and only what you see. Courbet is credited with coining the term realism. He was an empiricist. Empiricists, which included most scientists, believed that the only truth was truth that could be tested with experiment or at least scientifically observed. Courbet likewise rejected the abstract, the visionary, the theoretical, the religious. Art was about painting the world we live in with all its toil and poverty. So, what do you notice about this picture, particularly in contrast to the Academy painting we just saw? Stonebreaker's is not a sentimental view of country life. This is hard, sweaty, backbreaking work captured in dull browns and grays that echo a life of very few pleasures. Despite its size, the painting contains only 2 figures, one too young and one too old for the backbreaking work they're undertaking. So what about composition? Does this work have a focal point? The 2 workers are lit by a harsh sun, contrasting with the shadow of the hill looming over them. Yet their faces are hidden. They've been rendered anonymous, as they would have gone unnoticed by the upper middle class and upper class that dominated painting both as painters and as patrons. Every portion of the canvas is rendered in sharp detail, which has the effect, really, of eliminating a specific focal point. We have revealing light, but no spotlight. Here we see Courbet portraying rural labor, again unflinchingly. The woman on the left is exhausted, the woman in the center is holding up a heavy pan in muscled arms, and the cupboard, maybe an oven, that the boy opens appears to be empty. This is not a vision of rural plenty. So this is probably Courbet's most famous painting, though it's dropped off the list. In keeping with his perceived role as a recorder of real life, Courbet actually based this painting on a real event, the burial of his uncle back in his hometown. But despite the cross carried by a board attendant, the scene is bleak and unhopeful. It's decidedly unheroic, and not, despite the subject matter, especially spiritual. Note that the colors are once again dark and somber, with the exception of that splash of color in the center left. Courbet's unsentimental realism bothered Academy critics, all the more because he had the gall to paint this scene on a canvas that was 20 feet wide. The Academy artists also condemned what they saw as his crude application of paint. He often scraped it on with a palette knife. Courbet and other realists admired the loose brushstrokes of Dutch painters, and they copied this style. This painting gives you a better sense of Courbet's thickly applied paint. As I've mentioned before, the technique is called impasto. Here's another famous realist work that didn't make the cut, but I wanted you to see it. Gleaning is a very unsentimental subject. Gleaners collected the grain left over after the harvesting process. They were the poorest of the poor. But the realist painters weren't just trying to capture their world accurately, they wanted to change their world as well. Domi, like Hogarth, you remember Marriage a la Mode, caricatured what he saw as a corrupt elite, but his main preoccupation was the oppression of the urban working class. This lithograph is probably his most famous work, although it's not our required work by Domi. It captures a chilling and real historical event. A member of the Civil Guard, that's basically a policeman, was shot by someone inside a working class tenement. The remaining members of the Civil Guard stormed the housing block and massacred many of its residents. Domi was a journalist, and his prints were reproduced with the new mass media print technique of lithography. Lithography made it possible to mass produce newspaper art and later photography. So it had a transformative effect not only on art, but even more on journalism. The beginning of this clip shows you how lithographs are created. Here we see Domier's famous rendering of Louis Philippe, the bourgeois king brought to power by the Revolution of 1830, that's liberty leading your people, pictured as a bloated giant devouring the riches of his people. He was overthrown in the Revolution of 1848. And here's Domier's satire of the French Salon, the yearly show where the public viewed paintings approved and often sponsored by the French Academy. And here is Domier's extraordinarily unsentimental painting of the inhabitants of a third-class railway carriage. This is oil on canvas, by the way, not etching or lithograph, but you'll see that Domi still relies very heavily on line. Note that he employs a head-on point of view. Some art historians associate this with the rise of photography, where people looked into the camera. And we, the viewers, are presumably in the facing seat, that is, in the third-class carriage. Domi invites us not just to observe, but to participate in the lives of ordinary people. Finally, we see that Domi, like other realist painters, goes out of his way not to manipulate color to capture our attention or fire our emotions. He uses a lot of earth tones. Here's our required work by Domi. I'm actually going to come back to this lithograph in my next lecture on photography, but let's talk about it briefly now. Domi made this print soon after a French court ruled that photography was art, and therefore could receive protection in the form of a patent. It's worth noting that Domi had to work hard to convince people that lithography was an art, especially since his works were published in the popular press. I wonder if Domi also worried, in the end quite rightly, that photographs would replace drawings as the main pictorial art in newspapers. One of your homework readings also suggested that Domi might be sounding an alarm about the surveillance potential created by balloons, the drones of their day. And with that, on to photography.